Great. So hello and welcome to this edition of Foreign Press Correspondence Talk. My name is Atticus Kangas, a news associate with the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents, USA. And joining me today is Roman Krznaric. Roman is a writer and social philosopher, and quite frankly, a modern day Renaissance man whose career has also included time in academia, as well as being the founder of the world's first empathy museum. He is also a sought-after public speaker and one of the founding members of the School of Life, one of my personal favorite organizations. So thank you very much for joining me today, Roman.
Oh, it's a huge pleasure to be here, Atticus. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Great, as am I. So to begin, I'd love to hear about what first drew you into the world of philosophy. Was there a particular class, a particular event that really sparked your interest?
Well, I did study philosophy as an undergraduate at Oxford University. I live in the UK. I still live in the city of Oxford now, but I found my philosophy course kind of boring, actually. I found it very dry. I didn't think it was tackling what I thought was the great philosophical question, which is, how should we live? So in fact, I ditched philosophy and I ended up becoming a political scientist. I did a PhD in politics, in Latin American studies and those kind of things. So I call myself now a public philosopher or social philosopher. And because I've left academia, and that term public philosopher is one I stole from the Dutch, actually. The Dutch have this idea of a public philosopher. They even have a philosopher laureate, like some countries have a poet laureate who's appointed an official public philosopher. I love that idea. And so all my books that I've written really focus on that question of how should we live, which I think is the philosophical question. But for me, whereas I think for a lot of people, the idea of how should we live is a question about personal life, I'm also interested in how should we live as a society. So about the overlap between the art of living and social change. How should we live communally in nations, communities, families? So that's, to me, what public philosophy in a way is all about.
Great. Thank you very much. And so then building off of that, what inspired you to write your latest book, The Good Ancestor?
Yeah, so The Good Ancestor, in a way, the subtitle says it all. It's, long-term thinking for a short-term world, or in the US, the subtitle is a radical prescription for long-term thinking. But the idea of a good ancestor was a phrase I borrowed from the great immunologist Jonas Salk, who developed the first polio vaccine back in the 1950s and famously didn't patent it either. And he said, the great question facing our time is this: are we being good ancestors? In other words, how are we going to be remembered by the generations to come? And I remember when I first saw that question, probably about 5, 6, 7 years ago, the scales dropped from my eyes. I thought, that is the question for our time, because it seemed to tie together the problem of short-termism that we find underlying so many issues in society today. Our failure to act on the climate crisis is, a failure to see long-term consequences, to plan for the next pandemic on the horizon, to deal with racial injustice that gets passed on from generation to generation, to plan for the risks of new technologies like AI. And of course, the media has been getting increasingly short-term over the last few decades as well. It's all 24/7 news. And where's the slow news? Where's the non-breaking news? And it seemed to me that we urgently need to, in a way, develop a new mindset of long-term thinking. And that's really the impetus for the book. And I guess another impetus really is the fact that I've got kids. I have twins who just turned 13. And when I was writing this book, I was remembering, like say when my daughter was 10, I was thinking, if she lives to the age of 90, then she could easily be alive in the year 2100. So that future isn't science fiction. It's an intimate family fact, and so that future is actually much closer than we think, and it's tied often into our personal lives.
Mm-hmm. So then, regarding this emphasis on adopting a long-term mindset, how easy is it for a society to adjust to this way of thinking on a long-term basis?
Well, it's hugely challenging, because if you think about, the human mind, we're often caught in very short-term cycles. We're clicking the buy now button, swiping our phones. I call this the marshmallow brain, named after the famous marshmallow test, where psychologists were given, a marshmallow. Psychologists put marshmallow in front of little kids, and if they could resist eating it for 15 minutes, they were rewarded with a second marshmallow, and most kids couldn't resist and snatched the snack. But we also have in our brains what I call the acorn brain, which is the part of our brain, particularly here in the frontal lobe, which focuses on long-term thinking and planning and strategizing. And we're better at it than most creatures. A chimpanzee plans ahead a bit, right? They'll get a stick, strip off the leaves and turn it into a tool to poke into a termite hole, but they'll never make a dozen of those tools and set them aside for next week. And that's what human beings do. That's how we built the Great Wall of China and voyaged into space. It's how we plan for our pensions and write song lists for our own funerals. So we have a capacity to think long-term. We just don't put it into practice. And in fact, in a way, answering your question more directly, most of our institutions, political, economic, and so on, are not designed to bring out that acorn brain, that long-term brain. So classic example would be our political systems, where politicians are caught in short-term cycles. They can barely see beyond the next election or even the latest tweet, even though the consequences of our actions go way beyond elections, go decades ahead. The carbon we put into the sky will be there for centuries and even longer. So there's a kind of real disjuncture. But there are some countries, for instance, which are really taking on board the long term seriously. So in Wales, for example, they have a political position called the Future Generations Commissioner. And the job of the Future Generations Commissioner is to look at the impact of public policy in all areas, environmental, employment, education, healthcare, look at its impact up to 30 years ahead. So not super long term, but much further than your normal cycles. And the commissioner doesn't have as much power as she probably could have. Her name's Sophie Howe. She's fabulous. But it's an indication that some countries are starting to take the long term seriously. In the United Arab Emirates, they have a minister for the future. Why doesn't every country have something like a ministry for the future or a future generations commissioner or ombudsman?
Mm-hmm. And do you see the long-term approach as being the best or only solution to significant problems that our society will face, such as climate change, or do you see it being combined with other shorter-term approaches?
Clearly, long-term isn't the answer to everything, right? Social movements need to be organizing now, getting on the people on the streets to protest against the failures of the COP26 climate negotiations, for example, right? That requires short-term carpe diem action here and now. But we always have to be thinking about, well, what are we doing this for? What's our ultimate goal? And that requires, as a society, like, do we just want constant GDP growth, which has been the goal of most governments, left, right, or center, since the end of the Second World War? No, I think that if you're taking a seriously long-term view and thinking about the tens of billions of people who will inhabit the future, our economies cannot grow forever. Nothing in nature grows forever. Whether it's your children's feet or an oak tree, who are we to think that our economies can keep growing forever without doing serious damage to the planet? And we know we're using 1.7 planet Earths each year in terms of our carbon footprint, and there is no systematic evidence that we can what's called decouple GDP growth from greenhouse gas emissions or material use at anything like the pace and scale to stay below 1.5 degrees of heating. So we need to be thinking, okay, we need a different kind of economy, for instance, in the field of economics, a post-growth economy, which is about balance rather than growth. And there are lots of models around, like the donor economics model or well-being economics and degrowth models and so on. But they're asking us to keep a bigger goal in mind. So yes, we need things apart from long-term thinking, of course. But let's at least bring the voice of future generations into the room. That's why I've written my book, so that we can all be good ancestors, in a sense, to make sure that current generations' voices are heard as they are, but also that future generation voices are here too. That's what the Native American idea of seventh generation thinking is all about too. So let's have a fair debate by hearing, in a way, those voices of future generations in our decision making.
Great. And so then tying this into the field of journalism that the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents obviously deals with, is there a way for journalism to influence society positively and push people to think long term in this way that we've been talking about? Or does this system where news is being easily consumed online at the click of a button constantly, does that have the opposite effect?
Well, I think there's some incredibly innovative media projects around which take the long view and are trying to, in a way, switch our acorn brains on. So, for example, there's a US-based organization called Media 2070, which is a project about media reparations. And it's based on the recognition in the last couple of centuries in the US, the media has been dominated by white voices, white stories, white journalists, those kinds of things. And it's what I love about it is that it's a 50-year project, hence it's called Media 2070, to try and rebalance the voices in the media in terms of who owns the media, who's doing the reporting, what's reported on. And that's really about a deep structural change to do with the media and how it operates. But I think it's a recognition that it is possible to play a different media game, as it were. Of course, people still want to consume media fast, and they want to click and they want to swipe. But you see projects like that. And then I think you also see media projects which try and, I guess, promote what the Australian journalist John Pilger once called slow news, the kind of stuff that doesn't reach the front page. I mean, pick up the Guardian Weekly, which is my local, sort of regular reading. And the front page is almost always dedicated to a slower news story. It's not about the latest political scandal. It's about a famine. It's about climate. It's about some larger questions of justice, for example. In the Netherlands, they've got the great website, The Correspondent, which again tries to look at non-breaking slow news. And so the digital platforms can be used as much, I think, for slower news and as faster news. And I think just going back to the Guardian newspaper, just as an example, which I happen to know, I think was one of the pioneers, and there are many now, of the idea of a long read. People are reading now 3,000 to 5,000 word essays online, sort of New Yorker length style essays, in a way I think they probably weren't doing 15 years ago. So I think we're becoming better at being working with the long term in our digital media consumption. Well, what do you think?
Oh, good question, but this is for you to talk.
Okay.
Then to pivot the conversation a little bit, to talk about the School of Life, how has the organization, the School of Life, grown and changed over time? So is the present day organization what you envisioned, let's say, 10 or so years ago?
Yeah, so I was one of the founding faculty members of the School of Life back in 2008. And actually, I haven't been directly involved with them since about 2013. So my role I played was I designed a lot of the School of Life's original courses on work and politics and love. And I wrote a book with the School of Life called How to Find Fulfilling Work. And I've seen it evolve, I think, in a way from the outside over time. And on one fundamental level, it's been incredibly successful as an organization, because the whole idea of the School of Life was that every city or town should have a School of Life on its main street, next to the baker or the kebab shop. You should be able to go into a place called the School of Life and learn about the big questions of life, like, how to find fulfilling work, how to deal with death, how to make a relationship work. And within a few years, there were Schools of Life in over 15 cities around the world, and there still are. But over time, School of Life's created more and more online content, for example, online courses and videos and things like that. And I certainly didn't see that emerging when the School of Life first started. And I think it's a sign that we're, in a slightly different world, and that online consumption of ideas has become much more prominent. But I also think, and another interesting thing about the School of Life is, I think, maybe I would say this since I was involved in it at the beginning, I think it helped prompt or inspire a lot of sort of ideas-based organizations to emerge, really, to forefront, moving away from the old traditional sort of literary events, for writers and things, to getting people to come along to hear a psychologist, a philosopher, a neuroscientist talk, and to think that that was normal to go on a, we used to do these Sunday sermons at the School of Life, a secular sermon. We'd get a big thing to come at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning in a big church hall, but they wouldn't talk about religion. They would talk about the human brain, and there's huge appetite for this. And it gladdens me to see this more and more all around the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you. And I think we have time for just, one more question, but this is going to be pretty broad, and answer it however you feel best. But what is your major hope and your major fear for the future? It can be economic, political, environmental, what have you.
Big question. Well, I recently read a science fiction novel by Kim Stanley Robinson, the great American sci-fi writer. It's called 2312. It's set in the 24th century. And in that book, the present period we're in, between 2005 and 2060, is referred to as the Great Dithering, the period where we were just procrastinating. We knew what changes we had to make. And of course, in this book, he's talking about the ecological crisis. And I think my great fear is that we stay stuck in this period of the Great Dithering. And I think things like the COP26 negotiations are evidence that we are still in that era, and that we fail to jump into action in a way. So that's my fear, that we engage in piecemeal reformism with a few carbon targets here and some greenhouse gas emission reductions there, but it's not the fundamental transformations that we need. In terms of my great hope, well, I see, let's say, in the political field, a rejuvenation of, in a way, ancient Greek democracy, the idea of direct participation, the rise of citizens' assemblies. And what we find with citizens' assemblies, where random members of the public are invited to discuss issues like climate crisis or an aging society, they tend to take a longer term view. They're not caught in the same short-term cycle. So I think we're seeing a big change in the nature of democracy. And I think that offers great hope for the longer term, because it's clear that our existing politics is not up to the challenge, really, of taking the long view. Nation states and representative democracy were invented in the 18th and 19th century, not for the kind of age that we're in. So we need to reinvent what democracy looks like. And we need to put our faith in the fact that people, citizens, care about their children and grandchildren and future generations, and they will do more than most politicians to take that view. And we need to give them a voice. So I think that is one of the great challenges of our time, to bring the voice of everyday citizens who can help us take the long view and imagine the world that we need.
Those are very thorough answers to a very big final question. But thank you very much for your time with this half hour. And thank you for joining the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents. And have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the chat we've had. Bye.
Yes, thank you.